Go ahead.
Thank you. It's very kind. So first of all, congratulations for a remarkable and very relevant survey. I think there's a lot there to unpack. First, I must say that contrary to what I expected, I come out of the data very much encouraged. And I think I'm encouraged by the understanding that there are far, far more agreements about the fundamental values and foundational ethos of what Israel is than I think one could imagine from the current discourse. What I will say is I think one of the greatest disservices that has been made was the idea of Israel being as Jewish and democratic. This notion that emerged really in the 90s. And I think it did us a great disservice, which your data actually kind of puts aside, with the notion that one side cares about Jewish and one side cares about democratic. And you show that this perception exists, but it's not the reality. And I think the reality is indeed the reality. And the reason is that if one truly understands the sources of Israel's democracy, I would say that they rely 80% on the fact that Israel is Jewish, about another 18% on the fact that its structure is parliamentary, and the other 2%, which could be this or that institutional arrangement, that's all about it. And we are now fighting about the 2%, whereas our democracy is very strong. It's one of the reasons that throughout this crisis from the beginning, I was not for a single moment concerned to the strength of Israeli democracy. The comparisons that were made, for example, with Poland, with Hungary, with Turkey, I thought them ridiculous. Those are countries that either have never been truly democratic or that have been democratic for about 5 minutes. Democracies ultimately rest on norms, culture, history of a people. And contrary to what some people think, we have a proud democratic history and tradition, even more than the British. So here I will be on Disraeli's side in terms of the Jews versus the British. Our democratic tradition is Israeli. Israel is one of the world's oldest continuous democracies, as odd as it might sound. The Zionist movement is one of the world's oldest democratic institutions. The democratic institutions of the Jews and the diaspora are established. And of course, Judaism is a long established civilization of argumentation and disagreement, going back to Abraham, the Talmud. We draw on that. So as long as Israel's the Jewish state, we are pretty much assured of being a democracy. So it doesn't have to be two ideas as if they're separate. As long as we're a parliamentary system, we are relatively highly secure in being a democracy. Parliamentary systems tend to support democracy more than presidential systems that more easily devolve into authoritarian regimes. And the battle about this or that institutional arrangement between the courts and the Knesset is truly not at the core of what makes Israel a democracy. And I think it has been entirely heartening to look at the data they presented to show that we have much, much more agreements about our foundational ideals and ethos that we would think just by listening to people. So then what should we be concerned about? And I think what we're seeing is something that is common to the crisis of many democracies, is that we believe we have fear of the other. We are being divided. And whenever we are being divided, I always ask who is there that wants to conquer and what do they want to conquer? But clearly we are being divided. There exists, and we see it from the data, a broad Israeli center, and yet we are divided into opposing camps where a line is being drawn in the sand, and I'm sure all of us have felt it in recent months. We are demanded even to choose one of the camps to show our allegiance, and the lines are being drawn even stronger, the walls are being built higher, whereas in practice, we have a very powerful center. And I think the tragedy of what's happening in many democracies is that there are powers that are pushing people to oppose each other despite the existence of a center. And I think in that sense, promoting, talking about your findings and your data is clear to dispel the perceptions and the fear of the other. And I think that also goes to, one of the data that I found most amusing, of course, is the perception of the crisis. Seriously, by any objective measure, if people think this is the most difficult crisis in Israel's history, this is a luxurious crisis. And I know from your speaking in other that you said even old people who were in the Yom Kippur War think this is worse. This is, I think, a bit like women after birth forgetting how painful it was. We had more than 3,000 of our best and brightest killed. We now have had people in the streets protesting, and despite some elements of violence, this has been a luxury crisis. Societies where they feel that they're dealing with their deepest issues, with the question of the ethos of the future, that's not what it looks like. The United States went to the second bloodiest war of the 19th century over issues that were considered of similar import. Other countries, of course, saw, deep, violent divides. So the notion of people seeing this as the deepest crisis, I think, is not objective by any measure, but perhaps it does reflect a sense that wars are not real crises in the sense that we're united against a common enemy. And because this is internal, we should view it as more dangerous. I think it goes to a traditional Jewish mythology that the temples are brought down by the Jews or Jewish divisions or Jewish actions. I always found it a very narcissistic view of history. It's never the Babylonians, it's never the Romans, it's what we did. But it is the Babylonians and it is the Romans, and we're not very important in that sense. So the Yom Kippur War was a far bigger crisis. The War of Independence was, this is a luxurious crisis, but I think in terms of perception, people feel perhaps that something that deals with who we are, with internal divisions, somehow feels more serious than combating an external enemy, even though in reality it's not. And I'll just end by saying that the one thing that made me most optimistic is to see that whether people are depressed about what's going on or positive. And I thought it was funny that the more secular were half depressed and half determined. And the funny thing is that it's probably the same people. If you interview me one day, I would be depressed. If you interview me the second day, I would be determined or elated. But what I really found remarkable is that everyone is determined to fight for Israel. So contrary to the perception, for example, that existed for a while, that, left-wing seculars are, ruthless cosmopolitans with second passports who will escape Israel at the first opportunity, what we saw is exactly the opposite. These are people who are determined to fight for Israel. By the way, precisely because I think they understand that Israeliness doesn't travel well. We by now have enough experience that to be an Israeli abroad is not an easy experience. And what we've built here is remarkable. And it's not something that we can easily, if at all, take somewhere else. So it's worth fighting for right here. And I think this is at the crux of what's happening right now, is that no one is going anywhere. Everyone is determined to fight for Israel, and everyone wants a voice.